the challenge, the opportunity to connect. The 1960s, a time of imagination and change, a time of anger and fear. The 1960s, a program called Challenge.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Looked at our connections, our divisions, through the lens of faith. Nearly 60 years later, during these challenging times, we'll take a new look at our divisions, our connections, in a new program called Challenge 2.0. When we think of politics, we likely think of manipulation, the practice of maximizing personal benefit at the expense of others. But there are alternative definitions. Travel writer, author, and activist Rick Steves believes it can also describe the process of building bridges instead of walls. That's why he wrote the book Travel as a Political Act, to encourage bridge building, to reduce fear and enhance understanding. One trip, one encounter at a time. That's the focus of this edition of Challenge 2.0. Well, I'm very thankful that Rick Steves is appearing on our show and a guest of us today who has so much background and perspective. And I have to ask you, I think I read a quote somewhere, Rick, that you've spent about a quarter to a third of your adult life living out of carry-on luggage somewhere around the world. Is that true?
That's actually true, yeah. Ever since I've spent every summer since I graduated from high school in Europe. I've heard summers are nice in Seattle, but I wouldn't know.
You don't have that experience. It's the best time of the year to be here.
Isn't there a hydro, like a fast boat race or something like that? I don't.
There is. Some people like to go to that.
But no, I've spent 4 months a year ever since I graduated, mostly in Europe. Mm-hmm. And it's my work. I need to go over there to research my guidebooks and update things. And Europe's a big beat, you know. And
it's very big.
I'm in sort of a rut now. I spend April and May in the Mediterranean. Mm-hmm. I go home in June, and then July and August north of the Alps.
That's a rough rut to be in.
Yeah, nobody gives me any sympathy.
You won't get any here, at least not for that. Let me ask you this, Rick, and that is, it's a really unique niche, a really unique career that you've done and the perspectives that you've developed. What led you to that? What first aroused your interest in foreign cultures and traveling?
Well, I'll never forget the day must have been 8th grade or something like that, 9th grade. My dad came home and said, "Son, we're going to Europe to see the piano factories." And I thought, Dad, that's a silly idea. But he imported pianos from Germany and went over to see the piano factories. And I got over there and it really opened my eyes to the wonder of this world. Mm-hmm. I always joke when I set up my talks that, there's different candy, there's different pop. I had so much fun. A couple years later, I was in the train station in Copenhagen with my mom and dad. And I saw people just a couple years older than me, backpackers with Eurail passes, you know. And Europe was their playground, and exciting destinations were clicking up on the reader board. And I just thought, I looked at my mom and dad and I thought, I don't need you for this. Europe can be my playground too. So I was a piano teacher back then, didn't have much money. I was slumming around Europe every summer because the kids wouldn't practice in the summer. So I said, I'll see you in September. And I remember I was in a bank in Oslo lining up to change my traveler's checks. And I had 5 $20 traveler's checks to get $100. Counted my crowns, and I was really short. What's going on? I'm like $15 short or something. They said, here in Norway, we charge $4 per check for the transaction, not per transaction. And I had 5 $20 checks instead of a $100 check. So that made me pay 4 extra fees. Now, silly little thing, but if you're a novice traveler, your trip is riddled with these kind of expensive flubs. And I thought, well, I've learned my lesson. That was expensive. Next year, I went back with a $100 traveler's check to that same bank. And an American traveler in front of me had 5 $20 checks. And I thought, she's making the same mistake I learned from last year. If I could just package these lessons from my mistakes into a talk or a book or something like that, I'd have a good excuse to go back to Europe every year and update my material, and people could learn from my mistakes rather than their own and have a better trip.
And your focus has really been getting people out of the mindset of going in a big group, but encountering Europeans or wherever they go on a one-on-one basis. I think it was Mark Twain that once wrote, "The travel is fatal to prejudice and preconceptions and narrow-mindedness." Do you agree with that? And if so, have you seen any examples of where there's really a transformation in somebody that does travel for the first or second time?
Yeah. That's just so wise, what Mark Twain wrote. But he wasn't the first guy to write that. I mean, Muhammad, 1,400 years ago, said, "Don't tell me how educated you are. Tell me how much you've traveled." And I find today in our society, there's a lot of just closed-mindedness. I mean, people really think that we are the norm.
Mm-hmm.
That's the fundamental thing. We're not the norm. People who sit on something when they go to the toilet are not the norm. There's decals on airplanes in distant corners of the world that explain to people when they go on an airplane not to stand on the rim of the toilet and squat over it. I've had very powerful moments in my travels where I've just been instructed by local people that you're fine, but so am I.
Right.
You know, you use spoon and fork, I use my fingers. We're both just as civilized. And that's another, I find these little magic moments in my travels where, wow, that was perfect for my teaching. We need to get out of our comfort zone.
Mm-hmm.
We need to gain empathy with the other 96% of humanity. And that's a beautiful thing in your travels. But it's a choice, you know.
Mm-hmm.
You can choose to do that or not. Travel can be just simply recreation. It can be fun in the sun if you want, but it can also be transformational.
Now, you wrote the book, Travel as a Political Act. Politics, the word politics does not have a very positive connotation these days. Right. You mean something very different from that. Can you elaborate on that a little bit for us?
That is interesting, Jeff, because politics has become an unfortunate kind of thing because we're also dug into our trenches. Travel as a political act, for me that just means travel in a way where you take home what I consider the best souvenir, and that's a broader perspective. Mm-hmm. And not just have a broader perspective, but then use it. What haunts me is that the typical American, in the privacy of the voting booth, mm-hmm. it's an old-fashioned notion that you go into a voting booth to vote, I guess, but in the privacy of filling out your ballot, they vote only for their narrow, short-term self-interest. Mm-hmm. And of course, we would aspire to have ideals where we would vote for the greater good and what's ethical and what's right. But we vote in a very tight ethnocentric way. And when I come home, not because I'm noble or because I'm saintly or anything like that, but just because I've traveled and I've got an empathy for people who are south of the border, mm-hmm. I know that who wins this election is going to have a greater impact on people south of the border than it has on me. Mm-hmm. And I vote in an ethical way that takes that into account. But that's almost perverse in our world. We don't encourage people to do that. Mm-hmm. You know, it's all me. 4 more years. I'm better off than I was before. 4 more years. Screw who's ever south of the border. Yeah. And that's just heartbreaking if you have friends south of the border. Well, climate change is a good example. Mm-hmm. You know, climate change is a drag. We get hot, we get sweaty, we have to buy air conditioning. You know, south of the border, when I say south of the border, I'm talking about the global south or the developing world, or half of humanity trying to live on $5 a day. That doesn't have the refuge of, you know, air conditioning. Mm-hmm. Climate change hits the poorest people in the poorest countries hardest. So what we do really has an impact on people that are really struggling, and we don't even consider it. You know, if it comes and hurts us, then maybe we consider it.
You, in a very real sense, are a historian. I think you majored in college. As you look at how we've developed increasingly into dwelling within these information silos, how do you see some parallels? Where do you see some parallels for that elsewhere in history, elsewhere in the world?
As a historian, it was an accidental thing. I was just going to be a piano teacher. I'm able to sightsee and see things in a context, the contemporary context. Mm-hmm. You know, if you go to the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, you got to think of a world with no mirrors. Mm-hmm. And then you see these mirrors. Oh, baby. I guess this king is divinely ordained to rule us without question. You know, if you step into a Gothic church and see that stained glass, you got to realize the people who stepped into that church 800 years ago had pretty dark and gloomy lives. Mm-hmm. They had no hope. It was just, let's wait until we die and then maybe things will be okay. Step into church, you're reminded about what happens when we go to heaven. You think about how religion permeated society back then and how the church was a political entity in itself, allied with the different political elites, and how it was just common sense for them to keep the Bible in Latin so regular people couldn't read it, and then contrive different rituals and ceremonies where you really do think this educated person who speaks Latin can read the Holy Scriptures, interpret them, and then tell them to us. Mm-hmm. you think of what a huge way that is to keep down people. And then you think of how many people were burned as heretics for trying to translate the Bible into the local language. And then you think of how Martin Luther did it. And you think, whoa, that was quite an accomplishment. He pulled it off. That took courage, and then that empowered people to have direct access to what they considered the Word of God. To be able to see that in the context of somebody in the 15th century, you really get an appreciation for that German monk compared to somebody who looks at it from a 21st century perspective and kind of goes, okay, big deal, he translated the Bible. But to be able to see that in that context. So I really like that. Also, I really like to get an appreciation for the fact that all different societies are evolving on parallel tracks, and all different cultures and all different religions. And some societies have evolved a little farther than others. Some societies have had their revolution, they've had their Enlightenment, they've had their Vatican II, they've had their Reformation. Women don't have to wear hats. I mean, women used to wear hats here.
Right.
Now they don't. 100 years, that's not very long. Let's be patient. Everybody's evolving. Baggage is a big deal in my teaching because even as a kid, I was aware of baggage. Why do I have to clean my plate? Because of the Depression, that was Depression era baggage. Why do you have this problem with Japanese and German people? Well, look what they did to us in World War II. Why do we hate communists? Well, this is Red Scare time. What about Vietnam? What about 9/11? Baggage. Think of the baggage that 9/11 has laid on our country. It's 20 years later, basically. We lost 2,800 people. It's a terrible thing, but other people might look at us and say, okay, America, get a grip. For centuries, Central America's got baggage. Terrible civil wars. Guatemala had a civil war for 30 years. 200,000 people died. We framed it as communism versus freedom. Down there, they framed it as landless peasants trying to get rights to own land. I was just in Guatemala a couple months ago talking to an indigenous land rights organization. 5 of their comrades have been killed in the last year. 5 of them. And they say, if you're a landless peasant, or if you're a little tiny family farmer who owns a little patch of land, and the palm oil industry or the coffee plantation or the sugarcane plantation wants your land, they send their agent to sit down with you and they say, we'd like to buy your land. We can negotiate with you or we can negotiate with your widow. How much do you need? And then they have to go up the slopes of the volcano and they get the worst land. That's a real struggle. That's happening today. I witnessed it in the 1980s during the Sandinista Contra times, and I was just there 2 months ago, witnessed it again.
When you talk about those sort of experiences, those sort of examples, and we're going to talk more about that in a little bit, there's often the perception, I hear it when I take a trip, I know you've commented on that, it used to be people would say, bon voyage, and now they say, have a safe trip. You're challenged, gee, is that a safe place to go? Are you going to be okay? What is your response to that?
When somebody tells me I have a safe trip, I'm inclined to say, well, you have a safe stay at home. Because where I'm going, statistically, and I know statistics are optional these days, but where I'm going statistically is safer than staying right here. And it's so true. I mean, we have never been more fearful. I really believe, I've thought a lot about this because I'm in the business of selling tours. And for 30 years, I've been telling people, it's okay. Give me your money, take my tour, Go over there, you'll have fun. And I really believe that it's not at all reckless to go to Europe, even in the worst times of terrorism. Statistically, it's a terrible thing, but statistically, if there's just as much chance you're going to get in some violent crime here as if you're overseas, probably more.
Do you think that fear is manipulated at times, Rick, in terms of supporting a given worldview or a political view?
I think the fear is used against us, to make us more malleable. Fear is for people who don't get out very much. The flip side of fear is understanding. We gain understanding when we travel.
We're learning very much when we come to Iran.
For example?
For example, the people are not angry with America.
Yes. Government has a lot of war to each other because their benefits, but there's no war between people.
That's a very interesting point. So the governments have a difficult time, but the people, if we meet the people, It's like this.
Yes, they're friends to each other.
Yeah, it's like
They
this. I
should
like
be
that.
friends.
Yeah. So for Americans, we're very religious people, but we make the government and the church apart, you know.
It's not common to each other, but in Iran, unfortunately, the religious and the politics is mixed to each other.
Yeah. So this
And it's
is.
the main problem.
You think that's.
It's the main problem of, and it's the main point of that distance between people and government.
So you're a modern young woman,
Yeah, of course.
well educated.
I like to be.
Yeah. Then you must cover your hair.
It's a law in Iran.
I really value my worldview as a traveler because it connects me with the reality on this planet. And I believe if somebody has never traveled and they're buried deep in the middle of this great country, their worldview is most likely shaped by commercial television news. Mm-hmm. And it's charming to think that news is news, but it's not, it's entertainment. It used to be news. This is my own, you're a newsman.
I would bear that out. Cronkite, with the first time CBS Evening News turned a profit, they popped the champagne bottles, and Cronkite said, "Watch out what you wish for."
Seriously?
Seriously.
Because I use that same thing that I always think when they paid Walter Cronkite his check, the commercial news media was willingly, or the media was giving their news to the public as part of their contribution to our democracy. You know, ABC, NBC, CBS, and so on. They didn't try to make money during the news hour, willingly losing money. Now they realized, I think because they're privately held corporations that are legally obligated to their stockholders to profit maximize in the short term, they can't have the ideals of giving away the news if they have an opportunity to make a profit on it. And that's kind of what Walter Cronkite was predicting, I guess. And now it's just got to be amped up, doesn't it? It's got to be sexy, it's got to be bloody, it's got to be really thrilling. It's tuned back later, it's day number 422, and it turns news into entertainment. I like the entertainment, but I don't like to live in a democracy where the electorate's attitude is shaped by hysterical news. Mm-hmm. I wish there was news that could be just measured, balanced, boring, not trying to sell ads. When you're trying to sell ads, you need more clicks, you need more eyeballs. And I don't want to be eyeballs on a ratings chart when it comes to news. I want to be a fellow citizen. I want to be a neighbor in a caring community that's trying to figure out unprecedentedly complicated and threatening challenges to our country. We got to get together and figure this out. And right now, we tend to gravitate to our, liberal or conservative news sources, and I think it's really it's threatening to our democracy.
As you travel in Europe, and I know you've traveled well beyond that, we'll be getting into that at a later time, but when you travel in Europe, what are the biggest differences you see between the way of life, the attitudes of Europeans, and I know that covers a lot of territory, but between Europeans and those of us that call the United States our home?
You know, Jeff, I think that's why I love going to Europe, is it roughs up my ethnocentrism, my cultural confidence. I belong here. I'm an American. I'll always live here. I would not live in Europe. I'm just pretty darn American, And there's things about Europe that frustrate me. But I love the European notion of the piazza. My favorite European country is Italy. And something integral to Italian culture and the charm of Italy is the piazza. That's where everybody gathers, all different generations. It's just, we're not going home and have our automatic garage door close us off and then sit there in front of our TV with people just like us watching, not connecting. We're walking downtown and we're just checking in with each other and so on. That's a beautiful thing.
The concept of a piazza serving as a community center goes back to ancient times. Piazza Santa Maria in Trastevere is the heart of this neighborhood. With its broad and inviting steps, the fountain was actually designed to be a kind of neighborhood sofa.
Great part of exploring a neighborhood is just sitting on the main square.
Another thing about Europe is people find their niche and they do it with no apologies. If somebody works in a hotel or in a restaurant or is a guide or any number of livelihoods, I find that they don't do it as a jumping stone to the next thing. I just love that when somebody finds their niche. It's a real blessing when you find your niche. I mean, I would have found my niche as a piano teacher. I would have loved that, but I think I found a better niche for me as a travel teacher, and I'm really thankful for that. Something I've always wondered, what's the fundamental difference between the United States and Europe? We're both passionate about democracy, and we are government by, for, and of the people via the corporations that we own. Mm-hmm. It's not a judgmental statement. It's just, think about it. We like to have a government that clears the way so our corporations can really do well, and therefore we can prosper. In Europe, I think it's government by, for, and of the people in spite of the corporations that they own. They're no less capitalistic than we are. Mm-hmm. They just are looking at having the government provide parameters so that capitalism can be ethical and sustainable. And they realize that you got to look farther than the quarterly profit statement. I think that's something that could really threaten the fabric of our community, is this mindless, unethical insistence on short-term profits. That's been a change in our lifetime, is that we're now grabbing the short-term profit, and then we jump into something else that's going to give us a short-term profit, jump into something else that's going to give us a short-term profit. Europe organizes the situation so that you're better off steering a steady course and waiting for the honest profit, the long-term profit.
You've mentioned before in your writings that the impact of travel shouldn't just be when you're abroad, Europe, wherever it is, but it should continue long after you come home. What do you mean by that, and how do you try to continue to, if you will, allow those lessons to percolate through you after you've returned home?
Well, from a religious point of view, that's, to me, a matter of good stewardship. Mm-hmm. You know, if you care, golden rule, whatever your religion is, love your neighbor. I'm a Christian. I want to love my neighbor. I want to be aware and honest about the structural poverty on this planet. Mm-hmm. To me, that's just part of walking the talk. And if you spend all that money to go to a developing world country, and then you get a nice tan, you buy some cheap souvenirs, and you go home and you show pictures of it to your friends, that to me is not good stewardship. Mm-hmm. There's a responsibility. I just spent 5 years' income for a struggling family just for this vacation. And that family's trying to, take care of their kids and pay for their medical bills or whatever. And it's not a guilt trip. It's just, to me, it's just ethical to be mindful of that. I still go there, but I've got a responsibility now that I have a broader perspective and I've got some empathy to go home and be a global citizen politically. So this is, for me, the most important souvenir, to come home with a broader perspective and empathy for the other 96% of humanity. And then to make that what I call travel as a political act, we implement that by being mindful of the policies of our government on the rest of the world. That just makes travel more fun for me. I love it. I've been in places where I'm not supposed to go. I'm glad I've been there. I did it as a part of a Declaration of Independence. Mm-hmm. My government can't tell me I can't go to Cuba. I'm going to go to Cuba, and I'm going to find out, why does Cuba threaten us so much? Do I want to become a Cuban? Do I think their system is better? No. But they've got every right to have a more communal approach to things than we do, and I'd like to check it out.
What was your biggest surprise when you were there?
My biggest surprise in Cuba was there's no edge. There's a lot of poverty, but I didn't feel an angry edge. When you think about it, most Americans, when they assess a country, whether it's Iran or Cuba or whatever, they probably assess it by friends they have in this country that fled that country. Mm-hmm. Americans' perspective on Cuba is pretty much from the white Cubans, the European heritage Cubans who fled with Batista when Castro took over. And what struck me was the dark Cubans who are left on the island. So, your Marco Rubios are the privileged Cubans that are gone, and they're the Hispanic Cubans, and the black Cubans are still there. What you've got in Cuba today is a very poor country. A lot of Americans relate it to the United States, and they say, look, their system is crummy. We're more wealthy than they are. Our system works better. I think it's more fair to keep it on the same latitude. Compare Cuban economy, socialistic or communistic, with Honduran capitalism. And then you see there's the same amount of poverty and economic, desperation. But in one society, you've got the dignity of healthcare, education, and no crime. And in the other country, I don't think you do. You have elites on both sides. I'm not saying capitalism is better than communism or anything like that, but But compare it that way. Go there and talk to people. I was so struck by just the charm and the grace and the love of the poor person in the barrio in Havana. And I was walking around in Havana in the poor part of town after midnight with my kids. Felt perfectly safe. Perfectly safe. And you wouldn't do that in Tegucigalpa. You wouldn't do that in Managua. You certainly wouldn't do that in San Salvador, or maybe not even Chicago or Houston, if you stumbled into the wrong neighborhoods. So these are the kind of beautiful experiences you can have when you travel, but you're supposed to take it home as a souvenir. I long ago stopped taking home physical souvenirs, but I take home impressions, new understandings, new sympathies. I take home empathy, and then I weave it into my world here. And I happen to be a teacher, and part of my mission is to inspire Americans to venture beyond Orlando. Get out there, get out of your comfort zone.
Well, I'd say by all measures you've succeeded in that, and you're continuing to steer people in that way. We want to mention the Travel as a Political Act. Both the TV program that you did is available on your website and as a book. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
And I hope all of you will join us for our next edition of Challenge 2.0 when we're going to continue this conversation with Rick. Thank you very much.